Picture this. You wake up in the dark. The stone floor beneath your back is cold, sticky, and damp with something metallic smelling. You try to move, but your arms scream from the raw bite of chains sunk deep into your wrists. The air is heavy with the scent of iron, mold, and something sweetly rotting. You are not alone. Moans drift from the shadows low, whimpering sobs, some too weak to rise above a whisper. The drip of water echoes from the vaulted ceiling like a funeral bell. You do not know how long you've been here. You only remember her eyes, sharp, pale, detached, calculating. She looked at you not as a girl, not as a person, but as a vessel she would drain. Again, what you are about to discover is not legend. It is not myth. It is not a twisted fairy tale meant to frighten disobedient daughters. This is the documented history of one of the most prolific murderers in European history, Countess Elizabeth Bathory of Hungary. A woman born into privilege, protected by power, and allowed to indulge in horrors so staggering they rip open the thin veil of civility we believe history has woven over barbarism. Before we journey into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please consider liking this video and hitting that subscribe button for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. She was born in the year 1560 to one of the most powerful Protestant noble families in Transylvania, a land already soaked in blood from Ottoman wars, peasant uprisings, and Catholic persecution. Her father was a Bathory, her mother a Somlyo, both of them descended from princes and warlords. As a child, Elizabeth was not shielded from violence, but immersed in it. Executions were entertainment. Torture, a casual tool of discipline. A servant girl once caught stealing bread was stripped, smeared with honey, and staked naked in the sun. Elizabeth watched the ants burrow under the girl's eyelids, unmoved. She began suffering seizures as a young girl, blackouts, followed by manic fits of laughter, or silence, so deep it terrified even the most hardened attendants. A local healer claimed she was cursed by the moon. Her family called it noble blood sickness. Others, in whispers, called it possession. To understand how a child became the monster history would call the Blood Countess, we must look deeper, not only into her mind, but into the world that allowed it to grow. What happened next would make her castle a place mothers whispered about in the dark, where the cries of vanished girls echoed long after their bones were buried. But even as Elizabeth grew into womanhood, the world around her grew darker, colder, more cruel. Her betrothal was not a romantic union, but a transaction sealed before she turned 11, consummated before she turned 15. She was married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a soldier and minor noble, known in battle as the Black Knight of Hungary. While he rode against the Ottomans and impaled Turkish prisoners along the southern borders, she remained in the shadowy corridors of Çakti Castle. Çakti was not a palace. It was a fortress perched on a cliff, remote, wind-lashed, and thick with superstition. Its servants, mostly peasant girls from nearby villages, were brought in youngsome, no older than 10. They were poor, illiterate, and desperate, often sent by their parents in hopes of earning favour or coin. But inside these walls, behind the stone facade, a different system ruled. At first, the punishment seemed small, a slap for clumsiness, a caning for delay. Then came the branding irons, the needles, the forced nudity in the courtyard midwinter, where frostbite was the preferred outcome. Elizabeth kept meticulous notes. She documented names, offences, punishments, reactions. She called it her correction journal. Her favourite instruments had hot pincers, velvet ropes for necks and wrists, silver blades sharpened nightly, were stored in a special chest at the foot of her bed. By the year 1600, Elizabeth was already feared in whispers across Upper Hungary, yet no formal inquiry had been launched. Why? Because the system served her. The Lutheran priests stayed silent. The gentry turned their heads. Even King Matthias II owed her family money. Power cloaked her crimes, and she knew it. Ferenc's death in 1604 gave her unchecked freedom. No husband, no male oversight. Her cousin Gabor ruled Transylvania, and her uncle was the Palatine of Hungary. She became the sovereign of Chaktasy. The bloodletting escalated. Girls were abducted under false, pretentious-promised work, education, safety. Some were handed over by their parents. The peasant girls were kept in locked rooms, deprived of food, then beaten, stabbed, frozen, or burned. Elizabeth believed blood was youth. She believed pain purified the soul. Her experiments became ritualized. Witnesses would later testify to scenes that defy comprehension. Girls strung upside down while their throats were slit, the blood collected in basins. Elizabeth would smear it across her skin, sometimes soak in it, sometimes drink it. One maid who resisted was forced to eat her own flesh, sliced from her forearm. Others were buried alive, with only their heads exposed left for animals or frost. The institutional machinery surrounding her not only allowed this, but sustained it. Her servants, including women like Dorothea Sentes and Ilona Jo, became accomplices, either out of fear or allegiance. They helped restrain victims, dispose of bodies, silence survivors. A young boy named Janos later confessed to helping carry corpses to the gardens, where lime pits were dug and filled. The church remained disturbingly silent. Elizabeth, a noble Protestant in a volatile Catholic territory, was a useful tool to both sides. In public, she donated to orphanages and appeared at court functions. Behind closed doors, her brutality was methodical. We must understand, this was not madness. It was sanctioned sadism, a system of absolute feudal power where peasants were property. The law did not recognize their personhood. Elizabeth was judge, jury, and executioner. When a village woman came begging to know why her daughter had not returned from Chaktasy, she was beaten and exiled. No one returned twice. Some of the girls tried to flee. They broke locks with stolen nails, leapt from towers into the freezing ravine. One girl made it nearly 10 miles before a mounted servant ran her down. Her tongue was cut out before she was dragged back. Her corpse was later found under the Great Hall, half eaten by dogs. Despite the terror, whispers began to spread. Midwives noticed the rising number of vanished girls. Local priests murmured about the unnatural stillness around the castle, the constant smoke of the crematorium. A Lutheran pastor, István Magyari, risked everything to speak openly. He warned the court in 1609. Still, no one moved. It took a decade of mounting accusations, dozens of missing girls, and the eventual loss of noble daughters sent to Chaktasy for courtly education to provoke real action. Elizabeth grew arrogant. She believed her bloodline made her immortal. She had come to think of herself not as human, but as divine. To those locked in the dungeons, she was not a woman. She was a force of nature, a storm that came in velvet, a fever that whispered in your ear before it devoured you. And yet, even in this place of death, there were moments of quiet resistance. A girl named Clara, no older than 13, sang lullabies to the others while they were chained. Another, Esther, secretly passed around messages scratched into bits of bone, warnings for those newly arrived. Some girls tried to keep their minds alive by reciting psalms, even as the screams of others made the words shake in their mouths. There were alliances among the doomed. They braided each other's hair before executions. They made oaths to haunt the castle if they could not escape. They tried, in the final seconds, to die with dignity. Some even smiled at Elizabeth, daring her to see them as more than cattle. They were never remembered by name in the official records, only as young girl, servant, or village daughter. But they existed. They bled. They suffered. They died. And they mattered. What came next would expose not only the monster, but the rot beneath an empire, already cracking under the weight of its own cruelty. To understand the storm that would finally come for Elizabeth Bathory, we must first understand the fragility of power at the edge of empire. By 1610, Hungary was no longer a stable kingdom, but a fractured battleground, caught between Habsburg imperial ambition and Ottoman aggression. Religious tensions flared as Catholics and Protestants jockeyed for influence. The nobility held their titles like weapons, and the peasantry remained voiceless, expendable, erased. For years, Elizabeth had been untouchable, but political winds began to shift. Her cousin, Gabor Bathory, lost favour. The debt owed by King Matthias II loomed large, and suddenly Elizabeth's actions were no longer ignorable, they were useful. When young noble girls began to vanish from the castle, it was no longer just peasant blood being spilled. That was the crucial mistake. The same system that protected her now sought to erase her. On the night of December 29th, 1610, soldiers stormed Countess castle. They did not knock. They broke the doors. Inside, they found what the whispers had long foretold. The courtyard stank of ash and fat. Blood stained the walls. A half-naked girl was sprawled across a bench in the great hall, barely alive, her eyes wide with terror. 2 more were found dead in the cellar, their skin flayed in strips, their hands fused by fire. 1 witness vomited into the snow. Elizabeth did not run. She stood in her formal gown, unspeaking, as they catalogued her horrors. Dozens of bodies, hidden chambers, her instruments, perfectly cleaned, gleamed on silk cloth. She smiled at the guards. She believed she could not fall. She was arrested, but not tried in the conventional sense. A true trial would have exposed too many noble collaborators. Instead, her servants were tortured and interrogated. Dorothea Sentes confessed to over 80 murders. Ilona Joe claimed the Countess had killed more than 600. Testimonies described girls forced to strip each other, drink blood, eat ash, die slowly. Elizabeth's defense was never heard. She was never allowed to testify. Too dangerous, too noble, too scandalous. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, walled into a room in her own castle. 1 small opening, for food, no windows, no exit, only darkness and the memory of screams. For 4 years she lingered there. She wrote pleas to her cousins. They went unanswered. She scratched notes into the walls with her fingernails. No one read them. She refused food. She whispered to ghosts. By 1614, her body was found cold on the floor, curled like a child. There was no public execution, no formal confession, no justice for the hundreds who died nameless. The empire preferred silence. Her name was removed from noble registers. Her crimes blamed on madness, hysteria, demonic, possession, anything to avoid admitting that power had enabled her, protected her, required her. But the damage had been done. The reputation of the Bathory family never recovered. Peasant revolts flared in the wake of the trial, demanding accountability. Rumours of the Blood Countess spread far beyond Hungary. Her castle was said to be haunted. Her name became a curse. Over time, the story twisted. Legends claimed she bathed in blood to stay young. Some imagined her as a vampire, others as a misunderstood herbalist scapegoated by jealous men. But the records remain. The witness accounts, the bones. We must not forget what they tell us. Elizabeth Bathory was not only a monster, she was a product, a creation of a world that allowed the rich to feed on the poor, literally and figuratively. A feudal system where women were currency, where suffering was normalized, where institutions turned cruelty into inheritance. Her story echoes still, in every system that hides its abuses, in every institution that protects its elite at the cost of the powerless, in every place where silence is bought with gold. You wake up in the dark. You hear someone sobbing. Maybe this time it is not the past. Maybe it is the present. Maybe it is still happening. What followed was not justice, but erasure. Not healing, but forgetting. For generations after Elizabeth Bathory's death, the forests around Chacteach grew thick with superstition. Villagers claimed they heard weeping from the castle ruins. Shepherds avoided the hills. Children refused to speak her name aloud. And yet, the system that allowed her to thrive, aristocratic immunity, patriarchal blindness, institutional cruelty, remained largely unchanged. No monument was raised for the victims, no mass grave identified. Most were peasant girls whose families could not even write their own names. In court transcripts, they are called the short one, the redhead, the gypsy, the cripple. They died without documentation and therefore without memory. We do not know their stories because they were never asked to tell them. In the centuries that followed, the narrative morphed, romanticized, reframed. 18th century pamphlets called her a temptress. 19th century poets painted her as a tragic beauty, undone by madness. 20th century pulp novels made her a sexual predator, a caricature, a fetish object. They turned horror into spectacle, made mass murder a brand. The word Countess became seductive, cinematic, detached from pain. The real victims were lost beneath centuries of fantasy. And yet, in the cold clarity of court records and servant testimony, their voices whisper back. One girl, before she died, asked the servant tightening the ropes to pray with her. He refused. Another kept a piece of lace hidden in her dresser gift from her mother. It was found, stained with blood, but intact. A third, barely old enough to bleed, screamed only once during her entire ordeal. She died with her teeth clenched shut. These fragments, scattered and fragile, are all that remain. We must ask, how does a world allow such a woman to exist? How does it nourish her, reward her? Elizabeth Bathory was not only protected by her class, she was created by it. Every bruise left unpunished, every death overlooked, was a brick in the foundation of her legend. Chacteach Castle was not built on rock, but on silence, and we still see echoes of that silence today. In the systemic abuse of the powerless by the privileged, in institutions that cover up crimes to protect reputations, in families who trade daughters for influence, in governments that deny the suffering of the voiceless because they do not see them as real. The castle may have crumbled, the blood may have dried, but the system has not vanished. It has evolved. It no longer wears velvet gowns or carries branding irons. Now it wears lab coats, corporate badges, clerical robes, and political titles. It speaks in legal jargon and internal memos. But the logic is the same. Protect the powerful, silence the victim, preserve the order. We look back on Elizabeth Bathory and call her evil, but that word is too easy. It makes her an exception. It lets us off the hook. What if she was not an exception, but a mirror? What if the systems that created her still create others? The cruelty did not end with her. It merely found new names, new faces, new methods. And that is why her story must be told, not as folklore, not as a vampire tale, but as history, as warning, as memory. There are still girls who vanish without names. There are still institutions that erase them. There are still castles without windows, hidden in plain sight. And if we do not remember, if we do not listen, we are helping build them all over again. Long after her bones were sealed in an unmarked grave, Elizabeth Bathory's name persisted not in reverence but in dread. Her portrait was hidden, her castle slowly collapsed under centuries of neglect. Stones were stolen by locals for barns and fences. Ivy crept over the broken turrets like a funeral shroud. Yet, even in ruin, Countess refused to be silent. Tourists now wander its remains, snapping photos beside crumbling dungeon walls. They laugh nervously, pose dramatically, buying postcards and blood-red souvenirs. But the earth beneath their feet is not quiet. It holds stories not yet told. Dust does not forget screams. Meanwhile, the legacy of the girls those who served, who vanished, who died, remains largely unspoken. There are no statues in their honor. No official record names them all. No national apology has been made. It is as if their pain was part of the architecture, necessary for the elegance of the halls, the comfort of the Countess, the reputation of a noble house. We must sit with that discomfort. We must not look away. If you imagine you would have spoken out then, understand this. The system she lived in is not gone. It is modernized, sanitized, hidden behind bureaucracy, media, and wealth. Children are still trafficked. Victims are still disbelieved. Entire populations are still erased because their suffering is inconvenient to acknowledge. Elizabeth's castle was made of stone. Today's are made of policy, procedure, denial. Her victims were girls, deemed disposable by their world-poor, voiceless, often unrecorded. They were called liars when they cried out, or hysterics, or whores. They were made to feel complicit in their own pain. These are the same mechanisms used in modern abuse: shame, silence, systemic blindness. And what of Elizabeth herself? Perhaps, in that final dark room, walled in with only air and guilt, she realized what she had done. Or perhaps not. Her last recorded words were simple: "I do not understand why I am here." That is the truest horror of all, not just the violence, but the unrepentant entitlement behind it. We look back and wonder how she could believe she had the right to destroy so many lives, but she did not invent that belief. It was taught to her, reinforced, rewarded. She was a woman born into cruelty and shaped by a world that measured human worth in titles and tithes. And yet, we cannot let her childhood, her status, or her sickness absolve her. Elizabeth Bathory made choices. She inflicted pain not in desperation, but in delight. She tested boundaries until there were none left. She discovered that a system built on fear would never say enough. But we can say it, by remembering the girls not as footnotes, not as blood on marble floors, but as real people who laughed, who ached, who hoped we defy that silence. By naming the system that created Elizabeth, we disarm its next incarnation. You are not in the dark now. You are not chained. You are not gagged. You are reading this because you are willing to bear witness. And that is how the cycle begins to break. Not with justice, not with vengeance, but with memory, with refusing to let those who suffered be forgotten, with understanding that history is not behind us, but around us, always waiting for someone to look closer. And when you do, when you really listen, you might hear them. The girls, the lost, the silenced, not screaming, not weeping, just whispering, "Remember us."